on the services for ingress and egress traffic, and it became clear that we have kind of an inconsistent model. Services are really just destinations; they're not sources. So that made me look at what is source.service that we have in our attributes, which led to the kind of, there's a bunch of issues that already, it's kind of news to me, but everybody else knew this issue effectively. So source, we can't ensure that source.service is correct. It's a derived thing that it can easily be spoofed. And I believe that exposing that in its current form to the user is doing them a disservice, lulling them into a false sense of security. And considering security is one of our big selling features, we shouldn't do this. So we can either cut it or fix it. But I'm a little dubious about the fixing part. So fundamentally, architecturally, workloads are the things that are sending traffic throughout the mesh. We can identify the service account associated with a workload, but there's no real association between the service for traffic leaving a workload. We can't associate it with a service. We can cheat and say, well, traffic from any of these workloads, pretend it's from this service. And I'm not sure that's doing the user a favor or the opposite of a favor. So in lieu of an actual solution at this point, I would propose to just remove these attributes, and we can always add them back later if we have a cohesive way to express what the source service actually is. And note that at the proxy layer, when we're configuring the traffic rules, there is no source.service.
Wait, say that again. There's some noise on the line.
Yeah, there's somebody that's outside, I think in the wind. So when we're configuring the traffic rules in the proxy, there's no notion of source service at that layer. So this is introduced when you're going down to at the mixer level, and by removing it at the mixer level, we just we eliminate the problem and we get consistency across the whole stack.
Yeah, I mean, so I think it depends over the course of the lifetime of this project. People have been adamantly worried about the fact that there is no source service to saying that we must find one and declare a canonical one for all workloads and all traffic, so that we could do things like policy and telemetry in a consistent fashion. So it sounds like, though, you think that going with some sort of canonical service for any workload is not the right approach, or at least you think that's a bad user experience?
It's just my spidey sensor is tingling that I suspect that lying, effectively that's what it boils down to, lying and pretending this traffic is coming from this particular service will lead to downstream things that we don't like. Misattributed things. The user is going to set rules on service foo because he thinks it's service foo, but service foo actually never sends traffic because it's not been designated as the as being the recipient of all the traffic from a given workload. So I'm just afraid of the inconsistency, and once it's out there, it's irrevocable, as opposed to not putting the attribute and adding it later seems to be. Somebody has a better suggestion. I'm willing to...
So I've been watching this conversation for a while. Can you hear me, by the way?
Yes.
Okay. I've been watching this conversation over the last week, and I think that we might have multiple definitions of service, and I think that might be where part of the impedance mismatch is coming from. When I hear you talk about workload, obviously there's the Kubernetes sense of workload, but I think you're using it just in the general sense of a collection of similar things doing similar traffic. And I think a lot of the people who are thinking of source.service as the thing they want to attach policy to are using service as the same thing, as a collection of, a general name for a collection of things that are sending similar traffic.
Yeah.
And so I think maybe that's where the confusion's coming from.
Yeah, well, I mean, defining what a service is has been traditionally nearly impossible, which is frustrating because we're a service mesh.
So before this conversation over the last week, I had thought that Istio was using service to mean what it sounds like you're using workload for. Right, that everything was a service, and a service was an impossible to define thing, but it was the thing that it made sense to attach policy to.
Okay, and that is the model that I was operating on until discussing with Spike and clearly realizing that a single set of binaries can actually implement multiple services. That's fine on the way in, but on the way out, we can't tell this single set of binaries which service are they representing when they're issuing requests. We can't enforce this. We can't derive this. So therefore, having source.service in that context is misleading. The traffic is not coming from a particular service. It's coming from a bunch of running binaries somewhere. And
yeah,
right. So that there's a asymmetry there that's unsatisfactory. When we think of drawing nice graphs of service communicating services, it's a lot nicer. But that's just not the system we have. And further, when this kind of started to surface, I went back to look at what we do within Google with our. So it's no secret that Istio, the Istio architecture is modeled after the internal Google systems, and Istio, the internal Google system, has the notion of a service. But when that service is describing sources of traffic, it's done in terms of in Google it's called MDB groups, basically in terms of service accounts. So you got service as the destination for traffic, and service accounts are the source of traffic. So it was kind of stunning to me that after all this meandering on the Istio side, we ended up at suggesting the same model that already Google has had internally for.
I completely agree. I just thought this was something that Istio was intentionally doing differently.
So the stunning thing is also, if you go look at the Istio glossary on istio.io, something which we wrote 16 months ago or something, it in fact talks, maybe less than 16 months, but maybe a year ago, it in fact talks about workloads being the origin of traffic, the services are the targets, and we just kind of lost that. And of course we have, it's unclear, right? Throughout our docs, we also talk about service-to-service authentication. Well, really, it's workload-to-service authentication.
Yeah, I really don't like the term workload
also
Kubernetes specific, but we can use it in a general sense. But I think it's confusing since I don't know anyone who uses that term outside of Kubernetes.
Yeah, so it's also on the Istio glossary. We had a kind of trying to capture a generic term for what that is. But we could use something else.
That glossary, though, also said that for every workload, we would have a canonical service.
Yeah, I know.
So, I mean, that was the attempt to get around this issue, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I would hope that as we move into some of the tracing stuff we're doing, that we might actually be able to separate different source services from a single workload's traffic. If you know that a request came into a particular service and you have some kind of tracing key that you're actually extracting, then you can probably then identify the outgoing traffic as also being from that service.
Yeah, except there are legitimately services that have that are self-driven, that are not driven by input by the user, by external inputs, right? Mm-hmm. So those would need to be modeled as well. So the issue is that where Istio's initial claim to fame is, hey, we can come into a cluster and this just works without changing code. So if you have some code that can act as multiple services, without changing the code to have that code tell us which service it's acting as, we just can't make those determinations. So I expect in a fully modernized app, the common case is we'll have one workload per service account. It's all single cardinality, it works great. In the migration path, I would expect that you start with a jumbo service, jumbo binary that implements one service. The next step is jumbo binary implements multiple separate services. And then the next step is start teasing the jumbo binary to be separate binaries, each implementing one service. So I think the reality is our customers are going to see a lot of cases where there's one binary with multiple services, and we need to cater to that in a reasonable way.
Absolutely. I also think it's common to use multiple services in terms of load balancing or policy reasons, even if they're actually the same underlying service, right? I don't think that it's necessarily the case that the end state that everyone will end up with is one service per workload.
No, I agree. But I think that's kind of the when you get all the stars, that's what you're doing. Otherwise, I guess it's a best practice.
Yeah, I'm just super worried about the impact that this will have on all of the different design work that's happened so far, and on changing people's expectations if we actually decide to get rid of it.
Well, so if we get rid of it, then if all we do, so there's two sides of this. First, there's eliminating these attributes, which by itself has its own set of impacts. And then there's a configuration model we're looking at, which is we were just going to configure services, and now we're going to configure services and workloads as separate things. And so it's going to be kind of a first-class visible thing to the operator, the difference between the outgoing traffic configuration and the incoming traffic configuration, and that'll then affect any visualizations that we want to do. And it's just
it's no longer a service graph, right?
Well, that's what I actually said the other day. It's like, what we really have is a workload mesh, and services are in there to describe how you apply policies, incoming policies to a workload.
It's so funny to hear all of these are exactly the same things that I asked people one-on-one, a month or two ago, and they were all like, "Oh yeah, it totally works."
Well, so again, there are people who passionately feel that we should have services for all workloads.
Yeah.
And I guess the question is, how are you going to identify workload and workload config? Is it really service account config? And with auth turned off, how do we get that information validated, right? Or even present?
Yeah, so I don't have the answer to that yet. So my expectation is, yes, indeed, the workload configuration, it's actually not workload, it's service account config, but it's I think that's getting a little too far conceptually. So I'd say this is a workload config. It's associated with a particular service account. Beyond validate, I don't know how we do validation and what level of certainty we can offer there.
Does Istio even have a standardized answer for how to name a workload?
It's a string.
It's a string. So no.
Correct. Yeah. So well, no, that's the thing. With the only real way to identify a workload from Istio standpoint is through the service account, and the service account is named through is a spiffy string there, whatever it is, that format is. So yes.
So we have the service identity, which is in the spiffy string. We also have Kubernetes service accounts, which are slightly different.
But the thing you get from source.user is a spiffy account, right?
Yep. Yeah.
Yes. So source.user is in fact the thing that you need to use to apply your policies.
Is that the same as a workload though?
Well, it's a service account that's running the workload, and yes, those would be, we would consider them the same thing effectively.
So anything that source identity runs is considered the same?
Yeah. From a security perspective, yeah. And if you think about it, it makes sense. So from a security standpoint, the same service account can be running multiple different binaries, but they all have the same authority. So if I deny something to one particular binary, fine, the operator the user can go and add that functionality to the other binary and be allowed. So from a security standpoint, they're all the same.
Sure. I guess I have concerns about the non-auth deployments.
Yeah.
where source user is not ever specified, and we don't get the identities. So attaching policy for those scenarios seems just as important, and we need a way to be able to do that.
Yeah, labels. Right, so I'm trying to make a clear distinction between what we can guarantee and what we cannot. And to me, it's fine to say, hey, labels are whatever the user set at on the source pod or whatever environment you're running. And Istio washes its hands. Like, it is what it is. But for as much as possible, the other stuff, we need to be able to provide some level of guarantee that, yes, this is correct.
So if that's the answer, can we, is it acceptable to make the claim that if you want to do something that is more precise, everything must be in terms of source user with auth enabled? And otherwise, just like Kubernetes, we derive your service from the labels on the pod through label selectors, or, like that there is no, that is a best guess, or we have a special label or something, right? But we don't need to throw away those attributes. We just need to call out that these are derived, or these are clearly matched, and they are open to operator configuration.
Yeah, so that's effectively the plan we're on now, and I consider this having the users generally like in danger of being in the pit of failure here. If you look at our vocabulary of attributes, the number 2 attribute that's listed is source.service. And there's no mention anywhere about this being dangerous. And certainly, as I'm using it, I'm going to forget the fact that, oh, this is not authenticated. Shit.
So I don't understand why it can't be authenticated, right? I understand the problem that there be more than one, but it seems like Istio is in a position to validate and authenticate every single one of the attributes that describe a source workload.
Yeah, so that's part of the spectrum of possible solutions. We could just say, look, we're going to carry the service identity as part of the cert. And then we're just left with the problem of lying about the traffic is coming from this service.
Yeah, I think Istio should endeavor to authenticate as many attributes as it possibly can, right? If it knows it's running on Kubernetes, then it can go and validate even down to the single container level of the thing that's making the request.
Yeah,
I don't see why it shouldn't authenticate those attributes. So I don't think authentication.
Go ahead.
I was just saying, I don't think authentication is a good argument. I do find the fact that there may be more than one a more persuasive argument.
Yeah, so I mean, what we could do, right, is authenticate and say that you have to, for those scenarios, you're picking something for policy and telemetry that's awkward, but at least we could make it explicit, and then it wouldn't be as hidden.
How do you pick
so
something?
You could call it, huh?
How would you pick something?
Well, like Martin's saying, you could have a label saying, the label could be canonical service on the pod, or something like that, and then we could pull that out and use it instead of source.service, right? And that could be clearer and still provide sort of the functionality we have today.
You still need an answer for what to do if that attribute is missing, or that label is missing or incorrect, right? In the drop-in case of you already have a Kubernetes cluster at Istio, you're not going to have those labels set. And someone might set it to something that isn't actually pointing at the pod. And in both those cases, you need to still have some fallback behavior.
Right. So, I mean, we could fall back to what we're doing today. And I mean, so this also comes down to how much do we trust the deployments and the ability to edit those pod labels too, right?
Yeah, well, so it's a matter of a scope of authority. If you imagine a large mesh which has a mesh operator and several service operators, as the guy that's configuring a service, I can't vouch for what the other teams are doing, other service operators are doing with their labels on their pods. So right in the current model, anybody can pretend to be any other service, and there's no control. So
they can only do that on the sending side, because as soon as they do that, they'll start to retrieve traffic for the services, and that traffic will fail.
Yeah, correct. So, but that's the thing. I'm trying to call a particular service, and I can pretend to be somebody else. So I'll get the other person's authority as I call into it. right? By just changing the label on my pod.
Isn't that what MTLS is for?
Yeah, so
Right.
we're not using it that way though. Right, because
I mean,
source.service, but it's the same argument. So yes, we could enhance the authentication model to support this. Right now, it's not participating at this level. Source.service is just a label that we read from the source. Oh, Doug, are you saying that by virtue of putting that label on the source, that source is going to start receiving traffic?
Yeah, so like whatever labels you put on there that match the pod to the service, right? I mean, so there's a couple issues with how we do this, but if we were doing it 100% properly, the set of labels that a service describes as the selector for pods determines how service traffic flows down to that pod. So if you started attaching the labels that define your service to the pod, all of a sudden traffic coming in to the service you're claiming to be would be going to your pod, and you'd start having failures, right?
Oh, I thought we had a label. I thought we had a specific label that was unrelated to everything else. That's from which we extract the service name.
We do. Although that's not something that I've been wanting to fix for a while, right? To do it properly with label selection to match the Kubernetes model. Okay. And if we did that, then we would see failures on the incoming. We wouldn't see outgoing errors, which is an issue, right? But you could audit the other way.
Yeah. So now I could start stealing traffic potentially or something there.
Yeah.
I don't see how you could start stealing traffic. I mean,
you could make it so traffic no longer goes to where it's supposed to go.
But you could do that anyway by changing by setting the labels that are being matched by the service.
Yeah.
Right.
Interesting.
And as soon as you do that, if we're doing right. And that's my point. It's like once you do that and you can claim to be a service, and if we use that to look up the source service, we wouldn't get to audit it on the egress traffic, but on the incoming traffic, certainly there'd be failures and a way to determine, with NTLS on, a way to determine that that's happened. I don't know.
So, how confident are we that these kinds of tricks and things will work on non-Kubernetes systems?
I mean, I see this as devolving into an MTLS provisioning question. I think we should be able to pack arbitrary sets of attributes into the MTLS provisioning, and then it's on that provisioning process, on the certificate provisioning process, to figure out how to validate those attributes.
Okay, well,
I don't know that they're.
So I agree. I think we could safely deliver that information. And then are we content saying about the one-to-many problem? Just ignoring that. So there's a canonical service that's associated with every workload. It doesn't matter. It might be unrelated to the incoming traffic. We just say that's what it is.
So I think there is the potential to say that the fallback is the canonical, and when we start passing context in through tags, from tracing or whatever else, we have the potential to tease out. But yeah, again, I don't know. I feel like we're going to have to get customer feedback on that.
I had already made my peace with it, but I don't love it.
All right. So should we keep the attribute and just fix it so it's secure and with a canonical service?
I feel like we probably need a broader discussion. I don't know what the forum is to have that discussion. I mean, do we take it to security as well and then try and circle back here after that? What's your feeling, Martin?
Yeah, I wasn't sure about that same question. There's a number of cross-cutting things that I'm thinking about that I don't quite know how to engage to make progress. So this is one of those cases.
Is this something for the oversight group?
I suppose. Okay, so let me broaden the discussion. At least start with the news groups, the mailing list, and see maybe we need to do a cross-functional meeting to discuss this in more detail.
Okay. Well, I'm excited that we're having these discussions sort of in a more formal way because, like you said, they've been going on in sort of side hallways and things for months with no real progress or resolution. So, thank you for bringing that up.
Okay, so I'll actually take the text from the news group, turn that into a document, circulate it around, and maybe next week we can have a meeting to discuss this across teams.
Okay. Did you add the second agenda bullet point too?
Yeah. So when I was looking at this, I realized, we have several attributes that are just derived from the same one. Why the heck are we sending this over from Envoy on every request? We could just derive this on Mixer on the way in. So there's just string manipulations. Stuff like source.name is particular string part of source.service, and that kind of stuff. So in hindsight, we should have just exposed this as functions in the Mixer's language. So we, given source.service, give me the name part or the domain part or whatever.
Yeah, so I mean, this was sort of the intent behind the Kubernetes env adapter and Mixer, right? Was to derive things from source UID or destination UID, like pod name and everything else. So that functionality sort of exists within Mixer today. And some of the things that you listed, like destination domain and destination namespace, or maybe destination namespace, but destination name and destination domain, I don't think are populated by Envoy and certainly aren't derived to date in Mixer.
So where did they come from?
I don't think they're used.
Oh, okay.
so there's that. I think Mandar, it's too bad that he's not here today, is pretty adamant about having Pilot provide as many things as it possibly can to Envoy when possible, just because feelings that that's closer to the source of truth for the actual data.
But if there's attributes that are strictly string transformations over other attributes, that's the part I was annoyed by.
So that might not actually be happening right now. If you take a look at the things I sent, I don't think that we're actually doing anything like that currently. Yeah. But we're not doing them as string transformations either. So adding it to the function.
You define attributes that we're just not using.
Yeah.
At this point. Okay. Okay, so maybe we could delete those attributes then, or okay.
Yeah, or mark them as unused. I do think we need to improve the documentation on the attribute vocabulary about actual use and what's providing what. I mean, that was sort of what our attribute manifests were meant to indicate, but those are sort of murky and unmaintained.
Yes, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll start a separate thread on these attributes and see where we can go with that.
Okay. The only other thing I put on the agenda was I just wanted to follow up from last week because I don't know, I didn't know if there were bugs that came out or not for tracking things like switching to fail close for authentication on checks. Was there any progress made on that?
So I opened an issue for that.
Okay.
That's the only progress.
And what about secrets for adapters? I know we talked about how we're going to get credentials and secrets to adapters. Have we had expanded any thoughts on that?
So we have some issues. So I don't think so. And we have issues in Galley to deal with secrets in general in a cohesive way. So adapters should just be a special case of that, I think, in the end.
Okay. So okay. Is Scott here? I think he was here earlier at least. You had some questions about debugging adapter failures. Do you feel like you were able to figure that out a little more, or do we need a lot more documentation on that still? Probably.
Well, I think having more documentation would be helpful as far as strategies for solving problems in Istio. but I was able to get past the specific issue that I had.
All right. And then I guess Christopher added mixer CRD changes. Do you want to?
Oh yeah. That was the idea of flattening things, so we only have 3 kinds of CRDs.
Oh right, yes. What happened with that? Is that part of the config working groups agenda now, or is that going to be done?
I think Mandar was going to chase this down, and we want this done before 1.0. So before the config stuff kicks in.
Yeah, I CC'd Mandar on the open issue. Currently, everything is built kind of dynamically at runtime because you need to account for any adapters that'll come along.
Yeah.
Whereas in Pilot, they just have a static list of all the kinds that they're able to search for. But I'm not sure if we can have that luxury if we always want to have a explicit CRD for each adapter, or if there was supposed to be like a bundled adapter sort of thing.
No. So right now we do have a CRD per adapter. What Mandar was suggesting is there's an adapter config CRD, that's the type, and then inside of it is basically a proto.any. So that's adapter specific. So, but there's only one CRD flavor. That's
okay.
So I think that would simplify things end to end in how we do stuff. But it is a change relative to what we have. All the configs are invalid after that, and that kind of stuff. So we need to do it soon.
Should I reassign the issue to Mandar then, or?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yes, definitely, please.
Okay.
So Scott, regarding debuggability, I'm just finishing the initial design work for extending our logging system to support the notion of what I'm calling debug zones. So we've had complaints that when you turn debug level logging on, you get way too much skew. Right. So what we're going to do, so what I plan on doing is making it so on a per component basis, you can define the zone. The user on the command line can list the zones. By default, if you output without a zone within your component, that's what the user will see if he turns on debug level output, and then the user can then start adding more zones and then seeing more stuff. So like in the case of Mixer, you could have a zone that's the attribute zone. And those debug statements only come out when that zone is enabled. And so I think that I'm hoping that'll make our debug spew a little more usable.
Yeah, that sounds good. Oh, speaking of which, is it intentional that the logger that is given to adapters doesn't have a debug level?
Yeah, well, because we don't have. Let's see, what do you get now?
You get info and warn and error, I think.
Yeah, so that's all that we support throughout Istio at this point, and debug as well.
Well, there's no debug that's given to adapters.
Oh, well, that's not intentional.
And that's what I was talking about. Yeah.
Okay, so that I can fix that. Okay. Yeah, there's a to-do item in the source code around the adapter level logging, because it still looks a little bit like our old logging story and hasn't totally been migrated. So I guess I should finish that.
So just a quick question about the previous topic, the one kind per adapters. That would also be one kind for instances, right?
Yeah. So we have three CRDs for Mixer. Instances, adapter config, and handlers. And
with the gRPC adapters, we are going to have one more type for the templates as well, I believe.
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
All right.
Okay. Is there anything anyone else wants to talk about today, or?
How come I've got all the action items? I don't get it.
You're the lucky winner. There is one thing that came up. I think Scott's aware of it too. Was just providing adapters with resources like persistent disks. And I don't know what we want to do in terms of having some sort of canonical way of doing that, or if we want to sort of punt on that. But that's something that comes up in terms of reliability for things that batch data before dumping it somewhere else. So I just wanted to raise that as something we might want to start having a story around, especially for analytics pipelines, things like that.
Or billing pipeline, even more so.
Yes.
Oh boy. Yep. See, at least when we did this in Google, it took 4 or 5 years before we got to that point. Now we need to do this already. Yeah. Okay, so clearly this persistent disk. Are there any other big categories of things like this that you think are necessary? I think persistent disk, I think we can put a box around and deliver some useful functionality reasonably quickly.
Yeah, I think having a general storage story, but I don't know anything beyond that. That and creds, right, seem to be the two big adapter things.
Yeah, secrets and Okay, so I'll take another action item to at least open a tracking bug for this, since we don't have that anywhere.
Okay. Great. I didn't have anything else, but I think it's worth mentioning that with the Helm templates chart, the Helm charts that went in earlier this week, we now no longer have an Istio mixer service. We have Istio Telemetry and Istio Policy. So it's just something to be aware of moving forward.
And the word mixer is not in there?
I don't believe it is.
Because it's not good with our docs. Our docs talk about mixer.
Yeah, so we're going to have to update docs. We're going to have to. I mean, there's tons of things that sort of fall out of this. The dashboards is the policy and telemetry dashboard. We're now in the situation that you're describing, where we have one workload serving 2 services. So there's lots of things that sort of came out of that I think went sort of not as well called out. So that's something we're going to have to take a clean sweep of everything that we have over the next couple of days, and sort of try and straighten out.
And this was done for a non-existing problem.
I think it was done as part of the high availability, scalability work, but also rolled into just switching from the YAML templates to Helm templates. So it's sort of a double whammy.
All right, it's confusing.
But I don't have anything else. Anyone else want to?
I had a question related to the Mixer client. We have an open issue on buffering, which seems to happen in the Mixer filter, and it'll prematurely cut off requests over a certain size. I can attach in the issue here. It's actually on the Envoy repo, but they're saying it's potentially a buffering problem in the Mixer that we have. Not sure if anyone on the call is familiar with this, or if I should take it somewhere else.
Well, this is the right place, but I'm not familiar with the bug.
Yeah, I just posted it in
the header size is getting too large?
There's a specific setting per connection buffer limit bytes, and someone's trying to post like a 1 megabyte file against, I think it was just a demo app or something, and they noticed they get a 413 error. And on the Envoy side, they're saying most likely this should not happen because you should just be we're accepting streaming, and we're not going to do anything to cut that off unless you have a certain filter that's buffering prior to that. Then you might have problems. And it was shown that the Mixer, which filter exact? Yeah, the Mixer filter is buffering.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, it's buffering because it's making a request to Mixer?
Yeah, I mean, that would make sense, I guess.
Yeah.
So maybe the question is this configurable, or is this something that we can or cannot get around?
So presumably it's buffering for the length of the synchronous call to Mixer. That can be a long time.
Mm-hmm. So could it be stopping and waiting, and then it times out eventually as well?
Yeah. Wow.
So, I mean, it sounds like we could design a streaming filter. Still not sure how exactly that would.
But I think we have
Or
to,
just-
it has to be synchronous. It has to be blocking because we're checking to see if that, to allow this through.
To be sure I understand, like this is literally like one of the core pieces of Mixer to make sure that you're actually allowed to do this. That's why we're stopping. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, the buffer size is configurable, right? So we could. I don't know if there's a limit at which.
So Lynn gets around this by trying to set the per connection size to something huge in the pilot webhook, which is seemingly the only, like, I guess this is Envoy's catch-all in theory to let this through. But the issue is really in this specific filter itself.
Yeah, because if you're on a 10 gigabit pipe, you're streaming a large amount of content, and it takes 100 milliseconds to get down to Mixer and back. That's a boatload of data in your sidecar. Wow.
Yeah, so I guess this is something we need to have a larger discussion about. So I don't have any input here. How long has the bug been open on the? Oh, so is it within the last day?
Yeah, that one has been open just recently, but we have one in the Istio repository that was the original thing. I think it was open maybe close to a month ago. I could post that in here as well.
Yeah, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Gosh.
Okay. Martin, what do you think? Should we circle up with Wayne and try and figure out what we want to?
Yeah, let's start there. I from the face of it, I just can't. There just doesn't appear to be magic here.
No.
It's almost as though we need to let the data flow through and then cut it. If the check comes back with false, we say, okay, close the connection. Otherwise, you'll always end up with giant buffering problems.
Yeah.
Just to start myself to that issue, I'm interested in working on this, but it's mainly I'm looking for maybe a pointer on any ideas.
So what if we had a cap that we could control where if the buffer size exceeds 64 megabytes, the data is allowed to go through, and then we start buffering again, and when finally a check request comes back, we can decide whether you kill the connection or not.
How easy is that to do? I don't know the Envoy filter API very well. Is that? Oh, okay.
You're saying like allow it through, and then on the way back, whether you would allow the response to be returned or?
No, just further. So basically, cut the stream. If the determination is made that this should not occur, we cut the stream short, so no new bytes are sent to the service. So it's a leaky check. It's either that.
Related discussion.
Right, either that, or we have to have a hard limit on the amount of buffering we do, and then fail the request because we couldn't authenticate fast enough or authorize fast enough. That's kind of a trade-off.
We've had related discussions on TCP about long-lived connections, like whether or not checks should be run periodically.
Yeah, that's good.
So yeah, I don't know. I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah, well, I think maybe that probably ends up is the answer for long-lived connections. All we can do is kind of do it best effort, and it's no guarantees. Not satisfying.
No.
Okay, well, let's talk with Wayne and see if he has any bright ideas.
Thanks for bringing that up because I had missed that, Christopher.
Yeah, no problem. If we can post an issue after talking with him, that'd be great. I can try to experiment with a couple of these things. I'm on call this week, but I could start next week.
Alrighty.
Good luck in the on-call.
Thanks.
All right. Is that
Okay, anything else, or should we adjourn?
I think we're done.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
See you guys later.
Thanks.
That's it.